Kia ora koutou katoa. Welcome to another of the Vision Education Bite-Sized Learning videos. And remembering that in these sessions, we break down some of the key ideas that we've shared with you during our workshops. And the idea is that you can come back, you can revisit them, you can look at them yourself in terms of reflecting on your own practice, the shifts you are making through the course of PFS. Instruction and inquiry, and of course to share with other colleagues in your school. So we're continuing on this series and we'll sort of get straight into it, and lovely to have you with us. So if we just start here, I'll go up into my slideshow and we are ready, I think. Slideshow from current slide, ready to go. Right, okay, so bite-sized learning, and today is the second session that builds on the one that we looked at a couple of weeks ago, where we broke down the key components of the science of learning and the principles of the science of learning. So let's just recap, remembering that the science of learning is helping us to understand how the brain takes in and learns new information. So it's all around how we learn. And this is not just, of course, in the context of literacy, this is also right across the curriculum, which is why it's so important that at this stage of our project, as you get going with your inquiries and you're really delving into data around students who are not yet reaching curriculum expectations against NZC in literacy, either be it reading or writing, that you're looking at your practices and how these practices develop consistent approaches right across the curriculum. So literacy across the curriculum, instruction across the curriculum. So the science of learning does not just exist for the sake of literacy, but of course for us, that's what we're looking at through this project. So we're looking at how the brain takes in and learns new information, so how we learn, and we've pulled apart for the purposes of this series three main thoughts and principles for consideration. The first one is executive functioning, and they are the mental skills that help us to stay focused. The second is cognition and the cognitive processes like attending to information, cognitive theory, automaticity, metacognition, knowing about your learning, knowing when you're learning, knowing when you're not, being able to self-regulate and self-monitor your own learning, and the whole concept of memory and short-term memory and long-term memory, and understanding that memory is critical to learning. So today we're going to start in looking at a little bit more depth at some of the ideas we've developed in our workshops around our long-term memory system. So, I guess the first thing is to go back and reflect, why is it? Why is it that sometimes we can feel overwhelmed if we're learning lots of new things, as I'm sure we all have been through this journey? Why is it that we can sometimes completely forget what we've just heard? Why is it that we leave out steps when we're trying to achieve something? And, there are three resources that we draw on, all of us, regardless of age and stage, to think in order to think. And these resources are our environment, our working memory, and our long-term memory. So the environment, of course, is everything outside of our minds. It's the external environment. It's our classroom. It's our peers. It's the social environment we're in. It's books and materials we are exposed to. It's people that we know. So it's the environment that we draw on for learning and has a strong influence on us. Then, of course, we have our working memory, and as we discussed in our workshops, and we looked at some examples of this, it's the part of the memory where learning takes place, but thinking takes place, sorry, but it's got a limited capacity, and we can only hold so much information in our working memory, which also used to be referred to as short-term memory, at one time. So we juggle it in our minds, but we can't keep too much of it in there, as opposed to our long-term memory, and this is where all our memories are kept. It's all our events that we can continue to draw on. It's the facts, it's the processes. So learning shifts through from our is influenced by our environment, it shifts through our short-term working memory and goes into long-term memory. And of course, long-term memory is our storage. Information goes into our long-term memory, and when we retrieve it Remember, the retrieval part is the learning, when information comes out and can be used. So that's our whole focus on our short-term memory to long-term memory. Let's have a look at this model we looked at our second workshop together. It's developed from Ollie Lovell, and references there, where you can see in the person here, they are going into their environment. So going into their environment, paying attention to the things that are in their environment, and taking from their environment, be it the classroom, be it the reading lesson, from their environment, they are taking into their working memory what they are receiving, and from their working memory, this moves through the learning phase into long-term memory. Now, if it's not used in long-term memory, and remember the focus we've had on practice and space practice and retrieval practice, if it's not used regularly and frequently in long-term memory, see this little arrow that goes down the side here, it can be forgotten. But if it is used in long-term memory, it goes through memory, remind it, we're remembering, we're practicing, we're looking at new learning in different contexts. It can be used again. We can take out of our long-term memory, use it, and through it round we go. So we've got our environment, we've got our working memory, we've got our long-term memory, and have got here, if we're not really conscious of helping to make learning stick, that automaticity, that stickability we talked about, for all our students and all our learners, there are opportunities where learning can be forgotten, and that's what we're trying to avoid. And that's a critical principle of structured literacy, and a critical principle of the science of learning, that information goes into long-term memory and it is retained and it is used. So you'll remember we talked about information in and information out. And when information comes out and gets used, we know that information is learned, it's in long-term memory, and it's able to be applied across curricula to various different contexts. We also have to be aware inside that whole concept of working memory that we have a limited capacity, and if too much is in our limited capacity, in our working memory, which is limited, if too much is in there, we get to the stage of what we know and research talks to us about as being cognitive overload. And you'll remember we drew the diagram of this child that's got so many bits of information coming out that there's just no opportunity for them to process the information. It's not making sense. It's not linking to other things they know, their prior knowledge. It's not making connections. It becomes overwhelming, and then they cannot take on any more, and the information is lost. And that, of course, is called cognitive overload. So whatever takes up your working memory, we must make sure that the information in our working memory has the opportunity to be practiced, to be learned, to go into long-term memory and be practiced and be learned, so that it's automatic, it's stuck, and it's there for us to retrieve. So when we have too much learning at one time, too much new information, it leads to cognitive overload. And so the last bullet point here for us to refocus on, of course, is that we're all about chunking learning, and you'll know from the principles of structured literacy, learning is sequential, learning is cumulative, and so chunking learning up into pieces, bite-sized pieces, attainable pieces that each follow a logical sequence and cumulatively grow in terms of ability to process, to use, and at the end of the day, complexity. So that's a very important component to our work, so that we must make sure that we avoid cognitive overload for our students. So we have this kind of concept again, just summarizing what we've been talking about, that new information will take up considerable time in working memory, and considerable working capacity. So we must give multiple opportunities in our classroom to make sure that information becomes automatic. So we're reducing our cognitive load as we do that. So that is the focus or core focus on learning. So we need to have our planning really clear. We need to have our opportunities and our lessons really clear. We're chunking and we're being very, very explicit so that we're focusing on what the most important thing to learn in a lesson is. We clearly identify it. We're specifically sharing that with the students and we focus our lessons on that. Now, remember, we also talked about keeping away from the froth. Let's be explicit. There's all these lovely other things that go on in the classrooms, but let's stay away from that for the purposes of learning. Let's be explicit. Let's keep away from the froth and remember the purpose of the lesson. And remember that the purpose of instruction is to increase students' long-term memory. So how do we focus on this core learning? We keep away from redundant information. We don't clutter the learning with the students. We're quite explicit and precise, reducing the redundant information, and as our diagram we shared last session talked about, the froth of learning goes. The froth is not needed. Let's focus on exactly, explicitly what the learning is for the day, and let's focus on multiple opportunities, multiple interactions, keeping the students on task, lots of opportunities for responses to see that we know how students are taking the lesson, that they are developing their knowledge, that they're building their confidence, but keep it precisely on the goal of the lesson, not on other things that might be around. All right, so examples are providing clear definitions of the learning goals, giving a one-sentence summary, very clear and very precise. Today we're learning to, and tell the students what it is. Write down with the students what they are learning to. Then you read it, then the students read it, then the students read it to each other. So everyone's really, really clear on what the purpose of the learning for that lesson is. Provide examples, provide explicit explanation or demonstration. Let me show you what this means. Maybe if you're looking at showing a particular way of presenting information, show it one way, not in two or three or more, because when you get two or three or more ways, you're cluttering the learning and that becomes part of the froth. So one way of doing something, not several, for new learning to be able to be clearly understood, to become automatic and become part of the long-term memory that students can retrieve from and use and apply. So all of this work here needs to be focused specifically, on the core learning, the core goal for the lesson. I think it's really important that we remember to write down key information so that we avoid transient information and we avoid explaining something in two or three different ways, or we start using different language for the same thing. That's really, really confusing for so many of our learners. Let's show the example, how to use a full stop and a capital letter to punctuate a sentence. So if we're looking at sentences, and of course when we're looking at sentences, we're building in knowledge of punctuation as part of that work around sentences. If transient students have to remember it, if written down, students can refer to it as they do the task. If they have to remember the information, then they might forget it. So written down so it goes clear for students. It's very explicit. Students can refer back to it. And the other example that we've been, and as you know, we've been looking a lot at syllables recently through our Quick Learns, and a number of you are working with syllables as part of your decoding, encoding work with your PFS students. Another example is how to identify syllables as a decoding, encoding strategy. So again, if students have to remember it, they're going to not be so clear. If it's written down, they can refer to it as they do the task. And those are prompts that we can refer students back to and scaffolds. And of course, as they're doing that, they can explain their learning. They can use the think aloud approach. They can peer demonstrate. They can talk to each other about what they're doing and why, referring back to the core learning task. Chunking and automating is part and parcel of everything that we are looking at doing in terms of developing teaching approaches that lead to long-term memory and transfer and use of long-term memory. So the elements in our long-term memory, as we know, as more and more goes in, they become more complex over time, and smaller elements combine to form larger elements. And that approach is known also as chunking of learning, so that learning becomes part of a greater whole, I guess. And it allows learners to develop more and more complex thoughts and knowledge. So through our structured literacy instruction, we want to get to the point that cognitively demanding information is in our long-term memory, is cognitively challenging information. The more that builds, the more information that students are able to process, either cognitively challenging and cognitively demanding, so that it becomes part of long-term memory. And once it's long-term memory, it's automatic and it becomes much more, I suppose, we called the term, didn't we, in that diagram? It's easy peasy, it's stuck. There is stickability of new learning. So the implications for us, of course, let's just quickly review some of the ones that we talked about. Working memory has a limited capacity, so learning is maximised when new information is presented that is not overloaded. All right, and so we chunk up the new information and it's presented with the least distraction. We provide students with the information in manageable chunks or manageable steps. We give guidance, feedback, opportunity to practice. We use the gradual release of responsibility. The I do, we do together. You do together, you do on your own. So that we're going through the stages of gradual release, up and back, not necessarily linear, up and back depending on the challenges of the task and how students are responding to the task, and your observations and their feedback as they are learning the new task or the new problem that they are solving. So as they are becoming more adept at learning. I think we also talked, guys, here about making sure that learning always links to prior knowledge, because if it's linking to prior knowledge and we're making the links quite explicit to students, remember yesterday we did this, or remember earlier in the lesson we did this, now we're linking to this next part relates, here's how it all fits together, so that students have got something that the new learning will stick to. And that again is part of that cognition and metacognition, and the idea of stickability and automaticity. Lots of scaffolds to guide practice, and lots of opportunities, varied opportunities for students. Multiple and varied were the two words, of course, we used. Just very quickly remind you of this, of the memory curve and the forgetting curve here, and professional learning reading that we sent out to you around the forgetting curve. And this linked us to our work around developing long-term memory through spaced practice and through retrieval practice. And you can see very clearly here when something is first learned, if it is reviewed over several days, and you can see in this example after 1 day, after 3 days, and after 6 days, if over that time it is reviewed and gone back to, and students have the opportunity to engage with that again, then the chances of losing or forgetting are much, much reduced. So down the side, we've got our memory retention, and across the bottom, we've got our elapsed time. And as you consider this bite-sized learning session today, I would like you to go back and I'd like you to have a look at some of the activities that we shared, go into the Google Doc that we developed together or that you contributed to as part of our workshops, go into the information at the beginning of each of the stages in NZC about how students learn and the real importance of spaced practice and retrieval practice so that new learning becomes automatic over time. So, any questions, please email me. I've really enjoyed having the chance to share this quick bite-sized learning with you again today. Remember that you can go back at any stage to your notes. I do want to encourage you to go back to the teaching tips that we're sending out to you each week. There's lots of examples in there around spaced retrieval and spaced practice, retrieval practice, lots of opportunities to develop long-term memory. So check those, check the notes, and please be in touch with myself or your coach mentor if you have any further questions. Kia ora koutou katoa. Have a lovely day.